handsome guy. All right. First time here. What did you expect when David Crane reached out to you and your boss said, David, why don't you go?
I talked to a colleague, Eckhard Withoff, who'd been in the past, and he told me like the basic structure, but he said just enjoy it. And then I had a conversation with the prosecutor before I came to get my strict instructions on what was permissible to talk about and what was not. And he said the same thing. It's really enjoyable. He had come, I think, in his capacity as deputy prosecutor of the ISTY years ago, right, but never since he's been the prosecutor of the STL. And just they both said the same things about what everyone says about how nice the area itself is, and how it's just a nice couple of days. And I've been to other conferences where you kind of the topics, the ICL topics, I kind of know what to expect. But I think the unique thing is the Jackson focus, and the kind of Chautauqua Institute is really itself interesting, and the area is nice.
Well, I think that's why we're having the 9th.
Yeah.
Because folks like to come here, and historically, we can't guarantee it, but you have weather like we've just had. It might be a little hot, but tonight you'll be sitting on the porch, listening to Sharf, sitting in a wicker chair, having a glass of wine or whatever, and you'd say, "This is pretty good."
Yeah, it's really nice.
And be with some of your colleagues. Were you destined to be a lawyer? Was that something? Was it your family lawyers?
Sort of. I mean, not my parents, but my kind of a favorite uncle was, and I was an arguer apparently from before I can remember. So it always felt like, for maybe not the right reasons, a sort of a career path for me. So yeah, I guess I was kind of destined to be a lawyer. Not necessarily an international lawyer or international criminal lawyer. That was a convoluted path, like most of the people will say, because it wasn't even though I'm I guess a little bit more junior and younger than some of the actual prosecutors here. Really, it wasn't a career open to me when I left law school either. So
where did you go to law school?
I went to Boston University.
Oh, Boston, okay.
Yeah, and I graduated in &99, and the tribunals had started, but they were not talked about yet in U.S. law schools. You had to be really in the know. And it was more like military lawyers or the Justice Department guys who were kind of getting told about it. Hey, we want you to go and work for the ISTY prosecution. No one else knew. And there was a really small number of Americans working at the ISTR who had come by way of the ICTY, I think, and those were the only two tribunals running at that point. And yeah, so it was, I didn't learn about it for another couple of years, and then my interest was piqued.
When you got out of law school, did you go into the prosecutorial staff? You were a public defender? Did you do that?
I didn't do criminal law at all, actually. I did big law, sort of the commercial litigation at first a firm in Boston that's subsequently was kind of bought out or merged into a larger firm after I left. It was called Hutchins, Wheeler & Dittmar, relatively smaller firm. I mean, 110 lawyers, which for Boston was neither small nor big. And then I left there after a little bit less than a year and went to New York and worked for another big, one of those all-purpose firms, mostly corporate, but they had a big enough commercial litigation department, and I worked in that. And I realized quickly that it wasn't for me for a variety of reasons. I wasn't a fit in the big law world, and I was looking for something else to do. And I studied some international relations in the interim and learned more about the tribunals there. And said, okay, this is a way for me to use my legal training, but do something more public sector focused that I was interested in, and it was kind of fascinating for me.
So what was the aha moment? At some point, something became available.
I knew I talked to enough people that were working in the field, and I knew that the way in was the sort of take the internship. And I had, saved some money from my practice and decided to go and do a 6-month internship at the first one that would give me one, and that ended up being the ISTR. And working with the judges as opposed to the prosecution. I had been interested in the prosecution, but ended up being with the judges, and that led to my first job, which I then worked for assisting the judges at the ISTR for about 5 years.
What was your role there?
So it's kind of the equivalent of a clerk, but at the international courts, at least the ad hocs, you can kind of become career. They have the ones that assist the judges directly, most like a clerk, and then there are more senior lawyers that work supervising the work of all the clerks. And They rely even more heavily, I think, than U.S. judges on the clerks to write a lot of the, the first drafts of a lot of the decisions and judgments, and to do all the legal research, and then they deliberate on the basis of what's provided to them. So you have a really important role, sometimes too important of a role, given that the judges, depending on the judge, they might rely on you more than they ought to. So it was interesting, and I felt like a lot of responsibility, and it was a good way to get thrown into that field.
You were assigned to a specific judge, or?
Yeah, right at the beginning. At the beginning, I was assigned to a judge at the ISTR. Her name was Judge Khan. She was from Pakistan, and she was a presiding judge in a couple of cases. So I worked on all of her trials, and she was also the vice president of the tribunal at the time. So I had some work related to her more, the administrative function. All that was usually only when the president was, not acting in that capacity, because he was away. She would take over those duties. So that had some sort of diplomatic aspects to it, which was interesting.
Was there a lot of run-up, lead-up time to just sort of understand the whole world of international criminal law, and certainly its procedures, which in the outside world you'd say, I don't get it.
There is. There's a big learning curve for the law itself and the rules of procedure and evidence and all, which are, for an American lawyer, because of the ad hoc tribunals, at least the ISTY, ISTR, the rules have some familiarity because they were originally drafted heavily by U.S. lawyers. And so there's a lot of similarities to our federal rules of, evidence and federal rules of criminal procedure. So you do see that similarity, and the general principles are the same, but it takes you a while to realize that. Another big learning curve, though, at the tribunals is learning to work in an international environment, which is really, that's the biggest learning curve that I experienced and that I see every time someone new comes in, no matter how experienced they are as a lawyer. There's always that learning curve of figuring out how to work at the international level. Things just don't work the way you are used to in your national system, and they're in part because of the different expectations and different ways of working for different lawyers around the world, they're going to be a little bit slower and going to be, you have to get buy-in on things that you wouldn't have to in your domestic jurisdiction. So it takes a lot of time to accept that. And what I've learned over the years is the faster you accept that and start to see how you can make it work, the better. I resisted it for a little while. I was like, it shouldn't be this way. Why isn't it more efficient? And I see that with some lawyers who come in, and you really just kind of have to accept that it works somewhat differently, and then make it work.
Are you bilingual?
Not really. I mean, I have some French background, so I've studied it a bit, and I can read it well enough to go through like those parties that file in French. I can read their legal submissions, and I guess my sort of international legal French has developed over the years. But I feel like I spoke it and understood it better some years ago. And it's, even though I still do tend to read the submissions, I don't consider myself bilingual. I still take courses now and then to keep myself up enough to read it and to be able to quickly get a submission from the other side and go over it and know what we want to say in response. But not bilingual.
Did you, the ICTR is in a residual mode right now, I believe, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, was that kind of the tipping point for you to say, hey, now's an opportunity to do something else?
I left a little before it got, I left in 2010, so it was still very active. I mean, they were talking about the completion strategy at both the ISTR and the ISTY for years, but it was a very long and slow completion strategy. And so they're as the prosecutor Jallo was saying today, they're coming to the end of their final case at the end of this year. So I've been away for 5 years while they continued on their way, and I've had colleagues that are still there and are wrapping it up. I was interested in moving at that point away from working with the judges. I felt like it had been almost 5 years working with the judges, and I felt like that was enough. And I wanted to work for, preferably the prosecution somewhere, or the defense, one of the parties. I wanted to experience the international criminal world from a party's perspective. And I had a colleague who had worked at the STL, had left Chambers in the ISTR and worked at the STL, and he tipped me off to positions available every now and then, and one came up. So it worked out. It's actually a sort of, I guess, someone who was mentored by Sharf, Chris Rossi. He's been here in the past. So I worked with him in Chambers at the ISTR, and then he was at the STL before me as well.
before I get to that, did you find that when you're working for the judge at basically in a clerk type role, clerks who are working with federal district court judges or Supreme Court justices, sometimes feel like they might have a little bit of influence on how they view an issue? Do you find you had that kind of maybe impact on one or two or three cases?
I think, yeah, again, it depends on the judge, but my experience, and you know, some of my colleagues in chambers, former colleagues in chambers might not agree, I felt we had a big influence, bigger than, I had, you know, classmates in law school who worked, had federal clerkships, both at the district court level and the appellate level, and they talked about, you know, the degree of their influence and the discussions they would have with their judge, and it sounded more of a, you know, they were being mentored a bit by the judge, and yes, they would the judge would have them doing research, and they could influence the judge through a knowledgeable discussion. Some of the judges, the way the international judges are appointed, they don't always, you know, they're not international legal scholars, and they were the field itself was relatively new, even though it had been around for some years. So you could have an almost inordinate amount of influence. You know, sometimes it felt like it was on me when I was the one researching on an interlocutory decision or even aspects of a final judgment. And so we really relied on our fellow clerks to make sure that, you know, we were all checking our work before we would make any recommendations to the judges, on the chance that they wouldn't push back enough or, you know, do their own further background and would kind of accept what we recommended. Yeah. So that's, and then, you know, given the importance and magnitude of these cases, it shouldn't be on junior lawyers to be making, you know, not making the final decision, but basically doing all the background work that leads to the final decision.
Did you get involved in any of the decisions, or at least the conversations on the genocide question, which has been talked about? I think ICTR was one of them.
Yeah, ICTR is the of all the ad hocs, you know, every case had a genocide charge. It was the Genocide Tribunal, really. It was much more the focus of that tribunal than crimes against humanity or war crimes, unlike the STY. So, yes, basically every judgment dealt with genocide at the ICTR. So when they were talking about that today, it was in the context of early ICTY decisions, the Kirstich, that had a genocide charge. There was a limited number of judgments available from the ISTR that dealt with genocide at that time, but all of the ongoing cases that subsequently had judgments from the ISTR were also dealing with genocide.
Did you feel the pressure? Because that's a big term.
Yes, and of course, yeah. I mean, it's not, you want to be sure before you, you know, when you're going through the evidence and assisting the judges to go through the evidence and making any recommendations to them about what you think based on your view of the evidence in the law, that someone may or may not be guilty of genocide. You want to be sure.
Did the judges, you know, again, my model is the Supreme Court judges who meet cloistered, you know, together. Yep. There's no clerks there, there's nothing. They decide there, they take the vote, and then come out and decide with the clerks, the opinions, etc. Did that work the same way?
My understanding is it was different depending on, you know, different chambers and different trials. So the way the trials are set up is there's 3 judge panels, and the judgments that I worked on and even the, you know, interlocutory decisions in those cases, the judges always deliberated. Usually they would do so right in the presence of their legal officers. They would still have the discussion. And if they wanted to direct questions to us, they would, but we would otherwise just, you know, let them deliberate. Sometimes they would ask us to leave the room while they had some deliberations, but it was a mix. Yeah. There were my understanding is the practice of other chambers was to always have the legal officers leave the room while they had their deliberations, and others, you know, were more like mine and would keep the legal officers present. And there's always stories of certain trial chambers where they couldn't get along enough to even actually have face-to-face deliberations. So it would be sending papers around from one office to the other with this is what I think the draft should be. What do you put your comments in and get sent to the next, which seems very inefficient, but at least there was some sort of deliberative process going on.
Wow. So here you are, you're with the Office of the Prosecutor of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which didn't start off at least perceptively well.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's not that well known, frankly.
Yeah, it's not that well known. I mean, it's got a much more limited mandate, so it makes sense. You know, it's meant to be a smaller institution, and so I guess a little bit of a smaller reputation. And it's also, it's not. Oh, we talked about genocide. It's not a tribunal that's prosecuting genocide or any what are, you know, technically international crimes. All of our crimes are crimes under the Lebanese criminal code. We don't prosecute any international crimes. You know, one of those crimes is the Lebanese definition of terrorism. So that's what I think made it kind of feasible and sexy enough, to use a horrible term that's sometimes used in these contexts, to get a sort of internationalized tribunal going. There was some push towards, you know, getting a court in place that would deal with terrorism, and I think that influenced it. But the main push behind establishment of the STL was the fact that Lebanon reached out. They felt that, you know, the magnitude of the crime had opened a political space in Lebanon. The reaction to the crime, I guess, had opened a political space in Lebanon to try and do something about things that most Lebanese felt there was nothing that could be done about these things in the past when sort of political assassinations had happened. And there was, you know, political push from certain actors outside of Lebanon who also wanted to see something like this punished. And so they called for the tribunal. But yeah, it had a rocky start because it's always had mixed political support in the country itself. It's, you know, the fact that they put in absentia provisions in the statute and the rules showed that the powers that be that started the tribunal knew that there was a likelihood that we would have to proceed to a trial.
UN created, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was meant to be a treaty body between the state of Lebanon and the Secretary General, so the UN. That didn't end up happening. The UN signed, and Lebanon balked at the last minute. So the Security Council said, sign within the next couple of days, or we will put the agreement into place. Basically put the tribunal into place the way that we did with the other tribunals, the ad hocs, but it'll be still somewhat different. And so that ended up happening because the Lebanese could not come to an agreement and sign. So it ended up being put in place by the Security Council. But our legal status as whether or not we're a Security Council body or some sort of other body is still unclear.
For the camera, David, why don't you explain the backdrop? I mean, there was a fact pattern here that I'm not sure everybody understands.
The fact pattern of the
assassination?
Yeah, so on 14th February 2005, Rafiq Hariri, who was a former prime minister on more than one occasion, and I think it's fair to say the most influential political figure and probably private figure in Lebanon, you know, a very wealthy businessman in his own right as well, was traveling after a parliamentary session from Parliament in downtown Beirut back to his palace in his secure convoy down a coastal route. And as he passed by a particular hotel and passed by a large Mitsubishi Canter van parked along the side of the road, a suicide bomber sitting in the van blew up approximately 2,500 tons of TNT equivalent explosive, instantly killing Hariri, blowing up his secure convoy, and killing 21 other persons and injuring over 200 others. And, you know, there was, so very different from all the other tribunals, there was not a sort of widespread pattern of attacks in relation to some conflict where you knew who the on-the-ground perpetrators were. You just kind of had this case that was, okay, well, who did this? You know, an hour or roughly after the attack, there was a false claim of responsibility for some fictional terrorist group that no one had ever heard of, that put in calls to Al Jazeera and Reuters in Beirut. So there was immediately, instead of people, you know, the armed group being known, we had people deliberately trying to hide who did it. And so there was immediate outcry in Lebanon after this, and it ultimately led to the Syria leaving Lebanon. Syria had basically been controlling Lebanon militarily for a period of years, and they were kind of forced out through public outcry after this event. It was assumed that they were involved. And shortly thereafter, there started to be calls from at least those who, those segments of the Lebanese political spectrum that were really decrying the assassination, had been allies of Hariri, calls for international assistance in an investigation. And an investigative commission was formed, the United Nations Independent International Investigative Commission, bit of a mouthful, UNIIC. And they were given a kind of independent mandate to conduct their own investigation while also assisting the Lebanese authorities to investigate the attack itself. Through their life, which went on for a couple of years, their mandate was expanded to include some other political assassinations that had occurred around the same time period. And then during that time, while their investigation went on, there became a call for an international tribunal from some segments of Lebanese society, because they thought the political system and the judicial system in Lebanon was just not capable of conducting such a trial. It just wouldn't go forward. And so the process that I described earlier, where there was meant to be an agreement, it didn't work out, and the UN Security Council eventually put in place in 2007, passed a resolution for a tribunal, which then got started at the end of the first quarter of 2009. And we've been in place since then, so a bit over 6 years now. And we ended up kind of being the successor organization in a way to the UNIIC, taking all of their investigative materials as well as all those that have been gathered by the Lebanese authorities in relation to the Hariri assassination and the other related or connected cases.
What was the breakthrough to finally have some names to be attached to the incident?
The breakthrough came from investigations that had started before the tribunal was put in place, and we received that evidence from the Lebanese authorities and the UNIIC. So it was breakthroughs based on a particular individual in one of the Lebanese investigative bodies named Wissam Eid, who himself was assassinated not long after he made these breakthroughs. He had, on his own, decided that he would look at phone calls that had been made around the time of the assassination in the that activated cell towers near where the assassination took place. And he started looking at all these phone calls in his own painstaking way and through his own kind of technique, and identified a certain group of phones that had only called each other and that had stopped being used minutes after the attack, and expanded his investigation from there. And that's kind of what's led us to where we are today. And so we're kind of, the tribunal's very indebted to his efforts.
Sure.
And at first, the UNIIC was not as interested in his evidence, and there was some false starts in pursuing other possible individuals based on, persons who came in and kind of led the investigation down the wrong path, claiming to know all kinds of things about what had happened, and turned out to be, eventually through the investigations of the investigative commission, they realized these guys were completely fabricating everything. But it had led to certain generals in the Lebanese security forces who were affiliated, known to be close to Syria, being accused, and they were arrested and detained for a number of years. And then eventually, right when the tribunal was founded, one of the first things the first prosecutor of the STL did was request the pretrial judge of the tribunal to release them, because they weren't going to be, we just didn't have evidence to prosecute them. And so the tribunal was founded with some thinking, okay, these are the guys who will be tried, and they're already detained in Lebanon, and we've got a trial that's going to go this path, and then shortly thereafter,
wow,
they were released. So, it wasn't exactly starting from scratch. The steps towards where we are today were already in the works, but not everyone was aware.
So you have identified, what, 4?
5 now.
5 now?
Yeah, we added a 5th accused, joined to our trial in the end of 2013, beginning of 2014. And so we're now proceeding with the 5th accused. And that led to a little bit of an adjournment. The trial was meant to kind of get started right around that time, but we added the accused right at that time, and so their defense team needed time to get ready for trial.
As was indicated, and which I have some knowledge, the Martin Bormann case was the last one of somebody being tried for international war crimes against humanity, and that at Nuremberg. Did that become a conversation as to what happened in Nuremberg? With the Borman case, did that become a precedent at all?
It was a precedent in the sense that it was, there was some who argued that it was just impermissible at an international level to have a trial in absentia. Even though it was accepted in certain civil law jurisdictions that you could proceed to trial in absentia and, once certain requirements were met, there were those who wanted to argue that this could never be permissible at an international level. And so the Borman precedent was brought up in that context, saying, listen, it's not strictly forbidden. The first tribunal, the first modern international tribunal, international criminal tribunal, allowed that. So, to that limited degree, it was relied on. But it was more because we are not technically trying international crimes. The real basis for us was more that this is something that's permissible in Lebanon, and we are proceeding under the Lebanese, criminal code to a degree, and so this can be worked into our statute. And we'll also add protections that don't exist in any national system for in absentia trials by making it more of a, full rights of the accused represented by assigned counsel, which, for reasons that make a lot of sense in national jurisdictions, you don't go through that full process for an in absentia trial, especially because, people have the right to do-over. For the most part, if they do eventually get apprehended.
Like Karadzic and Mladic, are these guys hiding in plain sight?
Early on, we heard stories to that effect. There was a report by a journalist in Lebanon, in Beirut, around the time that our first indictment was issued, writing a report saying he had just interviewed one of the accused who had come to him saying, well, I'd like to be interviewed now that I'm one of the accused, And there were some statements by the head of Hezbollah, political head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, at the time that the indictment came out, suggesting that, no one would ever be turned over, no one who was one of their brothers, basically, would ever be turned over to the tribunal. That not being direct evidence that they were hiding in plain sight, but suggesting that it's possible that they were being protected. But we don't have any, at least that I'm aware of, credible reports of, after that time, of any of them being, having been cited anywhere.
The 5 are members of Hezbollah?
Well, it's difficult to say because it's not something where you can say there's a membership. But they are, supporters of Hezbollah. And beyond that, it's difficult to get any evidence of what their, if any, role might be. Now, Nasrallah, our position is that Nasrallah has basically claimed them by identifying them as brothers. But it's not an organization with any sort of organizational structure that can be easily identified.
How do you put in what's the evidence if you have these that you really haven't had any chance to even, do you have witnesses that kind of tie these 5 together?
It's actually the communications evidence that ties them together, and and with that, our role is to also attribute the phone use to them, and that's a complicated process involving some different techniques. But one of the main ones is co-location of personal mobile phones that are more readily attributable to them with what we would call more mission phones that are, not subscribed under any real name, but the fact that they're used in conjunction enough times is a technique that we can say, they're basically used at around the same place and the same time enough times. Say it's a reasonable inference that this is the same person using this phone. And it's also that the use of those mission phones, that's the evidence that we have that really ties them to the preparatory acts to the crime as well as the carrying out the crime. So it's a case built on those types of circumstances as opposed to the direct insider evidence that you get at some of the other tribunals, which makes it a real challenge and interesting. It's built very differently, but it's also a little bit more worrisome.
Well, have you had any pushback from the Lebanese telecommunications companies, where obviously that's the source of your records?
They've been really, for the most part, we've gotten the cooperation we've wanted. I think there was a time where there was a change in the Ministry of Telecommunications, and a subsequent minister started to push back a little bit. I'm not sure if the reasons had anything to do with opposition to the investigation or just concern over the amount of data that we were getting. but that, that was smoothed out. Our procedure is that we go to the Prosecutor General of Lebanon with any request for assistance and request for evidence that is related to our investigations, and then they kind of sort out themselves whether they, how they give it to us, what they can give to us. And we also do have the authority to go not just to the Prosecutor General, but directly to information providers. But usually we've gone through the Prosecutor General. And so, there could have been other discussions behind the scenes in Lebanon about this that we aren't aware, but we've had the cooperation and gotten, for the most part, the evidence we want.
So the government is supportive of this?
I think there's a mix. Lebanon's a very divided country. And the government incorporates elements from a variety of different political, affiliations. So there are aspects of certain members of the government that are more supportive of the tribunal, and certain members of the government that are less supportive. But we've gotten the cooperation that we've needed.
Where is it venued?
It's so the trial is venued in a town right outside The Hague,
Okay.
but we do also have a Beirut office. But the court proceedings take place there in the Netherlands.
Okay.
And yeah.
So you don't have I just think if it's in Beirut, security issues would be pretty high.
Yeah, security issues are higher at the Beirut field office. Security issues, I guess, at any one of these tribunals are a concern, and they all have quite good security. So even in our office in The Hague, we have a pretty good security system, but obviously it's less of a concern than it would be if we were based right in Beirut.
Timeline-wise, if you had to project, and again, assuming that somebody doesn't show up,
Yeah.
would you see yourself as a 2016, 17, or?
As far as the completion of the prosecution
Yeah.
case, I think we would be probably, it's safe to say by the middle of next year we would be done, I think, with presentation of our case and the main case related to the Hariri assassination. There are other investigations as well ongoing, and they may result in other cases. But no decision has been taken on that yet. And we don't really know in an in absentia proceeding like this what the defense will do, whether they'll present much of a positive defense case, presenting their own evidence, as opposed to, they've been putting us to our evidence throughout, and they've been cross-examining our witnesses and all of that. So, but they may that may be the main focus of their defense, and they may then just concentrate on their submissions at the end about how we haven't met our burden.
Yeah.
Given the technical nature of a lot of our evidence and the historical call data records from mobile phones, it might be reasonable to expect that jointly they might call an expert of their own to counter our experts in that area and to poke some holes in the whole theory of relying on that evidence for locations or attribution of use. But we don't know yet, because they're not in the position yet where they're even required to indicate what their intentions are in that regard.
So this sounds like it's a much more of a records case as opposed to a witness case.
It is, different varieties of records, but yeah, it is. And there was a big forensic case too, which hasn't been so much about linkage with the accused, but certainly just to establish what happened in the massive explosion itself, because we, I guess for understandable reasons, in an absentia proceeding, the counsel for the defense didn't feel like they were able to agree to just about anything, because they didn't have clients saying what they could or could not agree to. So they've put us to all aspects of our evidence. And that meant we spent a significant amount of time at the beginning of the trial putting on a pretty detailed and sophisticated forensic case about the explosion itself. And some of it related to, the perpetrators, but through the use of the van, which I think is the part that connects them. But most of it just about the number of victims and just demonstrating how the explosion was carried out for the sake of doing so.
It's amazing. Think about the tonnage there and the carnage.
Yeah. I mean, they really did a number on a significant bit of downtown Beirut. And it was, the tonnage is in itself, I think, a significant fact, because it shows that not just anyone could have pulled off this type of crime.
Was there any retrieval? I gotta believe the suicide driver, bomber, had a cell phone. Was that at all?
No, it was at ground zero of the explosion, so there was not much.
Yeah, I was just curious.
We do have DNA that is unidentified, but that we are we believe it has to be the suicide bomber. It's the only unidentified, human DNA picked up at the scene, and it's all small pieces, but no phone, no other evidence.
Physical evidence.
Yeah.
Are you excited about this?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and different case. So I've quite enjoyed, especially the kind of technical side of the case, and working on, getting to have some familiarity with how this telecommunications data works, and also some of the areas of law are different. That's kind of more my background, having come from chambers and being more of a behind-the-scenes legal research and writing guy. There's different issues for me to cut my teeth on, about terrorism-related stuff and in absentia issues, and what fairness requires in those circumstances. So it's a pretty exciting case to work on.
I bet. One of the things, I'm going to digress a little bit. There's an awful lot of students here.
Yeah.
Which is great. With the last couple of years, we've just had a lot of students, and they're affiliated with Case and Syracuse and Washington and Vanderbilt, among others. And they're attending. They're taking international criminal, humanitarian law classes and majors. And is there just curious, as these tribunals are just compressing and closing, and is there a field really for these students?
I've talked to a few of them about that, and I always talk to interns that come and work at our office. I think there is, and I think it's difficult to predict. The field is definitely contracting now, and it has been for a few years. I don't know if that means that it will necessarily always be that way. It may be that we've seen the height of the sort of modern international criminal law with the two ad hoc tribunals, which were big institutions with a lot of staff. But it may be that the ICC expands, or that there's another influx of ad hoc tribunals to deal with other situations of conflict or mass atrocity around the world to come.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, I think it's fair to say there's a little bit of tribunal fatigue with establishing anything new. Countries, the STL is a voluntary, in part voluntary donation tribunal, and you see that there is an issue every year of going around to get the money, and there is some fatigue from states having to pay for these long trials. So it may be that we won't see as many ad hoc tribunals set up, so the field may be smaller, but it's difficult to say. There's still a field. There's still a way in. There's always going to be some need for lawyers at least the ICC, and I think there's complementarity is another way of looking at it. There's more and more national systems are trying to take on these types of trials on their own, and people that have gone at least done some work, even if it's as volunteer interns, at one of the tribunals, the ICC, if that's the only one going in some years down the road, you'll have I think a leg up in going back to your national jurisdiction or to another jurisdiction where you can work and assisting with the sort of complementary type trials. So you can still work in a field that involves international crimes, mm-hmm. even if they're also domestic crimes in your national jurisdiction.
You have that. Well, of course, the same kind of thing holds true for the staffers.
Absolutely.
And these tribunals, as they're 30s, 40s, 50s, they're not quite ready to hang it up and write their memoirs.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in that position myself, and as I see the field contracting, and as an American, we're not state parties to the ICC, so we can get hired by the ICC, but officially it's meant to be on a secondary basis.
I was going to say, you're not going to never get to that upper level, because the United States, you're going to be potentially at the ICC. Yeah,
they've had some higher level figures, but certainly you're never going to be a sort of named the prosecutor or the deputy prosecutor or anything like that. Yeah, not possible. So yeah, it's a contracting field for all of us in the field as well. And there's a little bit of, at the same time, there are a couple of smaller things that have started up that would be something to keep in mind for both students and mid-career practitioners. I think it was mentioned earlier today by Prosecutor Brammertz of the STY. There's the Kosovo Tribunal, which is about to get started. There's this talk and then an agreement, at least in in the Central African Republic to start their own. I think to work, maybe somewhat in conjunction with what the ICC is already doing there, and talk of a possible. I forget the other. Anyway, talk of another possible ad hoc. So there's always little things that come up. So I wouldn't discourage anyone from trying to break into the field or stay in it.
Yeah. 10 years from now, what do you think you might be?
I guess if the field's still viable, I'll probably be in it because I've been in it for 10 years now and I'd like to stay. If not, I imagine that I will have found something either back here in the States on a domestic level that's related enough to the field, although domestic, or doing something else that's international, that's not international criminal law, but probably related to it. But it's difficult to say. I don't have that because of the nature of the field. I don't have that clear 5-year or 10-year plan. This is where I'll be, and that's both worrying and a little bit exciting.
Yeah. No, I'm just thrilled. So, what's a question you normally get asked that I haven't even thought about asking?
I think you've hit most of the big ones. It's always about the last topic is the most popular from most people because a lot of people that have these types of Q&As are interested in breaking into the field. And then a lot of the questions are the ones that I can't answer because they go to what's Syria's involvement, and that we stay away from. Given the nature of politics in the Middle East, it's good for us to focus on our mandate at the STL and not wade into that arena.
I thought I would not. I'd love to ask it, but I know I couldn't. I could ask it, but I wouldn't get a good answer.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, terrific. Thank you for coming and enjoy the next. Are you here till Wednesday?
No, actually, I'm unfortunately leaving a little bit earlier tomorrow before the close. I'm heading to New York for a night. I lived there for 6 years, so I'm catching up with some former friends and colleagues.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and then I fly out back to The Hague on Wednesday evening.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David, for making this special effort.
Yeah, thank you.
If the Bible tells you so, and you believe in rock and roll, and music's in your mortal soul, can you teach me how to dance real slow? Well, I know that you're in love with him, 'cause I saw you dancing in the gym. You both kicked off your shoes. May I take those rhythm and blues? That was a low for some happy news. She just smiled and turned away. I went down to the sacred store